We are on to chapter 17. In this chapter, we're going to be looking more at kind of like how does natural selection occur, what things are present, and what's happening to allow natural selection to occur. So, in this first lesson, what we're doing is looking at genes and the variation we have within genes that allows for evolution by natural selection. So we're going to start by looking at genetics and how genetics and evolutionary theory kind of come together. So a review, genotype is your genetics, right? What alleles did you get? And phenotype is how does that present itself? What does that look like? So natural selection is going to act on your phenotype, right? So we talked about finches, okay, and how finches that have like bigger, stronger beaks were able to eat bigger, harder seeds, and so then they could survive. So it's the phenotype, the fact that they have these big beaks, not the alleles that they got for those big beaks. Okay, so natural selection is act natural selection is acting directly on phenotype and then indirectly on your alleles. Okay. So certain phenotypes are going to be better suited to the environment, and individuals who have those phenotypes are going to produce more offspring. And then they would have higher fitness. Those would be the organisms we would describe as having higher fitness, and they pass on more copies of their genes to the next generation. So natural selection is not acting directly on your genes, it's acting directly on your actual trait, your physical appearance or your physical trait that you have. And then the entire organism is either going to survive or die without reproducing. Okay. So natural selection is acting on phenotype, not the genotype. But when we're trying to determine if evolution or natural selection is occurring, we're going to look at the population in the gene pool. So, a population is any group of individuals of the same species that live in the same area so that they can mate and they can produce viable offspring. Okay. Uh, the gene pool is within that population all of the genes and all of the alleles for each gene that are present. From that, we can calculate what we call the allele frequency, and you're going to do this in a lab uh, where you're going to figure out the number of times that an allele is occurring compared to the total number of alleles for that gene. So the more frequent you have a particular allele, right, the more often it's occurring. So evolution, in terms of genetics, what we're looking for is changing the allele frequency over time. So when we're talking about evolution, we're saying that the population is changing because the allele frequency is changing, not the individuals. The individuals don't evolve. Okay. Individuals survive or die, but the individuals don't evolve. The population evolves. There are three main sources of genetic variation that come into play. So remember, when we're talking about natural selection, we said there has to be genetic variation in order for natural selection to occur. So we're going to look at each of these three: mutations, recombination, and lateral gene transfer. So mutations, we've talked about before, a change to the genetic material. So mutation can only affect fitness if it changes the organism's phenotype. Um, and in order to affect evolution, it has to occur in the germline. Okay, so if the mutation is randomly in one of your body cells, it doesn't matter. Okay, so we have some examples of mutations to look at that would possibly um, increase or decrease that individual's fitness. Okay, so the fact of having this one yellow uh, petal may not do anything for the flower, or it might cause this flower to not attract as many pollinators. So this flower may or may not actually pass on its particular set of genes. Um, so if this reduces its ability to attract pollinators, then it's not going to have as many offspring. Okay. But in order for that to really have any effect, that has to be in the germline. So, in terms of affecting evolution, it has to be within the germline so that any flowers that do get produced from this particular flower, any plants that get produced, they could also have this trait. Genetic recombination we talked about in chapter 11 with crossing over. So genetic recombination provides variation because we have these events that can increase how our genes are kind of organized in a sense, right? Which genes that we're getting and which ones we're passing on, right? So if crossing over, which is we have these um, homologous chromosomes, right? So we have one set from dad and one set from mom, and they can cross over and they can swap pieces of DNA. So this is how you could have individuals that have a little bit of your maternal grandmother and maybe some of your paternal grandfather, and you get all sorts of combinations of alleles that are possible. Okay. And then this one here is showing independent assortment, that um, we could have these chromosomes line up so that these two that are both from dad are on one side and the ones that are both from mom are on the other side. And so then you get one set of gamete combinations, or we could line up more randomly. And so we could produce a different set of gametes. Okay, so remember that's independent assortment. Uh, that when our chromosomes line up during meiosis 1, they line up randomly and they just get randomly assigned, randomly sorted into the gametes. All right, lateral gene transfer. This occurs in single-celled organisms like bacteria, where they get to just kind of pass their genetics from one individual to another. They can just kind of, here, have a copy of my DNA for things. So bacteria have these circular chromosomes. They can also have what's called a plasmid. And so they can share, it's specifically this plasmid that they tend to share. So on this particular plasmid, this bacteria has a gene for antibiotic resistance. So that means that antibiotics are not going to affect this particular bacteria like they would other bacteria. Remember, antibiotics are what we take to kill bacteria when we have an infection. Okay. And so if this bacteria is resistant to certain antibiotics and they pass that on to another bacteria, well, now we have more bacteria that are antibiotic resistant. And so over time, we are going to have to develop new antibiotics because the old ones aren't working anymore. And this can happen between the same species or even different species of bacteria. They tend to have to be somewhat closely related, but yeah, they can just kind of pass that on and give another bacterial cell their antibiotic resistance, which can be a problem for us. Okay, the last topic that we're covering today is single gene and polygenic traits. Kind of what that looks like, how we can tell the difference between them. So if it's a single gene trait, remember that means that there's one gene that controls the trait. So they typically have just a few phenotypes. They only come in a few very distinctive forms. So here's one list, right? You either have something or you don't have it. Or like in the case of like blood groups, right? There's four phenotypes, sorry. It can be A, B, or O, but they're very distinctive, okay? Whereas polygenic traits, you have at least two genes, and each of those genes has at least two alleles, so you have lots of possible genotypes and even more phenotypes, and it's not always distinctive. So when you graph a polygenic trait, it tends to form a bell curve. So a single gene trait, when you make your bar graphs, you make a bar graph and you would have just these very distinctive bars. You have like 2 to 4 usually. When you graph a polygenic trait and you graph the range, you get a bell curve. Okay. So the extremes tend to be pretty rare, but you get kind of everywhere in between. And so the middle form is typically kind of the most common, but not always. Okay, so I'm hoping that makes some sense. That, I believe, is the end of lesson 1 for chapter 17. Um, so you need to know that evolution is acting on the population, not on individuals. That is acting on phenotype directly. That it occurs because of genetic variation, which is caused by either mutation, recombination, or lateral gene transfer. And that single gene and polygenic traits, you need to know the difference between those. We're going to talk more about those coming up in the following lessons.